Hello, everybody, and today we're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law, otherwise known as the legislative process. This is kind of the classic government lesson, right? How a bill becomes a law, and I hope you guys saw the old Schoolhouse Rock video that I posted, and that's a lot of fun, and I think gives you a good broad overview of how this works. I'm going to kind of cover some of the more nitty-gritty here, and then there's also a quiz to go along with this so that, you could show that you know the process. And then next week, so you won't get anything more tomorrow. Tomorrow's just kind of your catch-up day. And then Monday, we're going to actually kind of go into, okay, what is the job like for individual senators and representatives, and, how they go about doing their job, and how things have really kind of changed in modern times in terms of lawmaking. But this is the classic how a bill becomes a law process. A bill can be introduced in either the House of Representatives, which I'm just going to call the House from now on, or in the Senate. So it can be introduced in either place. The only exception is revenue bills or bills which raise taxes. Those, like I said a couple of days ago, those have to be introduced in the House. And any member can introduce a bill on any topic. So, you might expect that, a senator who has, sits on the Foreign Relations Committee might introduce a bill dealing with foreign relations. And he could, but he doesn't have to. He could also introduce a bill that deals with banking. Any member can introduce a bill on any topic. In the House, you actually put the bill in a big box that's called the hopper. In the Senate, you just give it to the Senate clerk, which I don't think is as cool. I feel like it's, big day when you walk down to the House floor and you put the bill in the hopper, right? And then after this, you start to see how much power leadership has in determining what happens. Because once your bill goes in the hopper, or you give it to the Senate clerk, depending on whether you're House or Senate, your bill is now really in the fate of leadership. And that means if you're in the House, the Speaker of the House, or if you're in the Senate, it means the majority leader. And in some cases, they can look at your bill and they can do absolutely nothing. They can say, I think your bill's trash. I'm not going to do anything with it. That's not very common. It's kind of, just to ignore your bill and not assign it is considered, I think, kind of dirty pool. You're not supposed to do that. If your bill is on something that needs to happen, today, is an emergency, then your bill could be introduced and then it could be immediately scheduled for a vote of the full House or Senate. So, we all want to, make a bill to, provide more money for schools to do online schooling. I say we're going to give $1 million to every school for online schooling. And then everyone's like, oh yeah, we need to do this today. And so you put it in the hopper, and then the Speaker of the House is like, all right, it's scheduled for a vote this afternoon. Let's go. You can do that, but again, doesn't really happen. Very rare that a bill goes immediately to a full floor vote. 99% of the time, the bill gets assigned to a committee. And these are what we call standing committees, and that's important. Standing committees are committees that exist all the time, and they're all for different topics. So there's a committee on foreign relations, there's a committee on banking, there's a committee on agriculture, there's a committee on education. If the government does it, there's probably a committee about it. Lawmakers are always keen to get seats on the powerful committees. Some of these committees have a lot of power, some of these committees are kind of backwaters. Those committees that deal with money, like Ways and Means and Appropriations, tend to be powerful committees. You want to be on those committees, and if you're really cool, you want to be the chairperson of those committees. Depending on who you are as a senator or congressman and who you represent, where you're from, you might be more or less keen to be on certain committees. I can imagine, for example, a congressman from Iowa might be more keen to be on the Agriculture Committee, whereas a senator from New York might want to be on the Banking Committee. Because those topics deal with things that are going to be more important to their constituents, the people that they represent. Committee assignments are determined by party leadership. So again, you see party leadership really controls your fate. It controls what happens to your bills, and it controls what happens to you. You make party leadership happy, they give you the committee assignments you want. You make party leadership mad, and they don't give you the committee assignments that you want. And remember, your vote as a congressman or a senator in the full House or Senate is important, but it's a small chunk, and it's hard to leverage it for anything else. You can't really use it to gain any more power because everyone's got the same thing that you do. Everyone's got the same vote. And so it tends to be that the real power that you have, if you want to become a congressperson or a senator who's very powerful, it tends to be where you are in the committee structure, whether you're committee chairperson and what committees that you serve on. And so many people in Congress feel like the way that they can represent their constituents best is to amass power on these committees, and then they can use their power on those committees to, make laws that are favorable to the people that they represent. So the committee process, most bills reach the committee and then they just die there. The committee chairperson controls what bills go to markup, and markup is where the committee members start looking at the bill. Most bills go to a committee and the chairperson says, I don't really care about this, we're not going to look at it. It doesn't go to markup, it just dies. And frankly, many bills deserve to die because they're dumb. Some person apparently made a bill to stop the Treasury Department from issuing trillion-dollar platinum coins. I don't think the Treasury Department has any intention of issuing trillion-dollar platinum coins. That's a ridiculous bill. It deserved to die. There's plenty of other bills that deserve to die. But it is, you can see, again, the committee chairperson has a lot of power here because they control what bills come up and what bills don't. The bills that come up for markup, tends to be where Congress really does the work, does the nitty-gritty. Most of the work of Congress is not done on the full floor. It is done in these committees. So this is where the bills tend to get amended or changed. There might be something that the author of the bill didn't think of that needs to be changed to make it work. This is oftentimes the place for people who aren't in Congress but are people who might be affected by this bill. Like if, we had a bill that was going to affect schools, school teachers and administrators would want to get their voice heard and say, this is how this bill is going to affect us, positive or negative. And the way to kind of influence legislators is a process called lobbying. We'll talk more about lobbying because lobbying can kind of be seen as kind of an almost corrupt process the way it works sometimes, but on its basic level of people telling their, senators and congressmen their opinion and, saying how they think the bill should look and what would help them, is, I think, a perfectly okay thing to do. The people in Congress are not necessarily experts at the bills that they're writing. You're going to have a variety of expertise, but not everyone who's going to vote on the, financial regulations is going to be a banking expert. Not every person who's going to vote on air quality standards is going to be an environmental scientist. So these people really actually need the help of experts to tell them how these bills are going to work. And it's certainly true that sometimes that means that those experts perhaps have more influence because the actual people voting on the bill don't really understand them, and only the people sitting behind them who are kind of the experts on this really do. And so becoming one of those experts and becoming kind of the person whispering into the senator's ear, yeah, you really want to support this bill because it's going to do this, is an oftentimes a very powerful position to be in. All right, so your bill goes through markup, and let's say a majority of the committee members like the bill. Remember, the majority of the committee is not everyone in the House or the Senate. It's just a small chunk, but it is going to roughly approximate the party differential. And so if the Republicans control the Senate, most of the committee members are going to be Republicans. If the Democrats control the House, most of the House committee members are going to be Democrats. And the chairperson, of course, is in the majority party always. So it tends to be that the party in power, their bills tend to take priority and get worked on far more than the minority parties do. So if a majority of the committee members like the bill after considering it and possibly amending it, they can vote to recommend the bill to the full House or Senate. And so if they vote and they recommend the bill, once again, the speaker or the majority leader has a lot of power, because once again, they could simply ignore the committee's recommendation and not do anything and not call the bill to a vote. And usually, if they don't feel like the bill will A, pass, and B, pass with majority of their party supporting it, they will not generally have it voted on. If the leader likes the bill, believes that the bill could pass a vote of the full House or Senate, then they can schedule a vote. One thing to note, in the Senate, I told you that individual senators have a little bit more power, and usually a group of 40 or more senators can prevent a vote from happening by basically using a kind of rolling filibuster. In order to move from debating about a bill to actually voting on a bill, in the Senate you have to do this thing called invoking cloture. And to invoke cloture, you need a 60-40 vote of the Senate. And so if there's even 41 senators who don't like a bill, even if they're in the minority, if they agree to just keep going up and talking about the bill, and they all vote against, cloture, they can kind of talk this bill to death. And so, again, this is a way that the Senate really kind of slows down the process of lawmaking. Some people have criticized this, say this is, not right, that if you have majority, you should be able to pass the bill, but this is the way it works. Each chamber can adopt different rules for what happens when you're actually on the full House floor. Sometimes amendments are allowed, so a bill comes up and you're sitting there on the floor and you say, I think there should be an amendment. You can propose that. And amendments can be anything. Amendments can have nothing to do with the bill at all. Sometimes opposition lawmakers will try to include so-called poison pills as amendments, things that are popular, so they're hard to vote against, but aren't really what the people who are voting the bill want to do. So, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Let's imagine that the Republicans want to pass a bill to what's a good example of a Republican legislative priority? The Republicans want to create a bill to create a nationwide system for voting ID requirements. Republicans have been very concerned that there might be people who aren't eligible to vote voting in elections, so they want to create a system where everyone anywhere in the country to vote in an election has to have, this certain kind of ID. Democrats don't like this very much. They think that disenfranchises people who don't have driver's licenses, and they don't think that people, voting who are ineligible is really a big deal, so they want to stop this, but they don't have the votes to stop it. So they propose an amendment to increase the minimum wage. You might say, well, what the heck does the minimum wage have to do with voting IDs? Absolutely nothing. But increasing the minimum wage is popular. So now all the Republican people in the Senate either have to include the minimum wage increase in there, which they don't really want to do because they don't want to increase the minimum wage, or they all have to be on record as voting against it. And that, of course, would be less popular. And so by proposing amendments that are poison pills, you could perhaps slow down the process. And I think you can see why sometimes amendments would not be allowed. Because, the minority is going to try to slow down the process. They can use amendments to do that. So sometimes they just say, no amendments at all. You're just going to consider the bill as it came out of committee. Now, that can be a problem if the full House or Senate realizes that there's a big problem with this bill and it needs an amendment. But if that doesn't happen, then you can move forward. Usually, rules in the Senate are less restrictive. Usually, rules in the House are more restrictive. If the bill manages to make its way to a vote of the full House or Senate and it passes, then it has to go to the other chamber. If it passes the House, it goes to the Senate. If it passes the Senate, it goes to the House. And the process begins anew. The leader can choose where it goes. So if it was in the House, it passed the House, now it goes to the majority leader in the Senate. The majority leader in the Senate usually sends it back to a committee. So the process starts all the way over, and so then it has to go through the committee process again. And again, it could change. It could be amended at the other House committee. It could be amended on the floor again. If the second chamber passes it in exactly the same version that it was passed in the first chamber, so the House passed it, the Senate passed exactly the same version, then it goes to the president. However, if the second chamber amended the bill, then the bill has to go to a conference committee. So the House passed it, they sent it to the Senate passed it, but they changed something a little bit. So let's think of our, $1 million for every school in America for online learning. The House passes that. The Senate says, you know what, $1 million is a lot. How about $800,000? Okay, so then they pass that. But now there's a disagreement. The two versions of the bill are not the same. So then we have a conference committee. And so members of the House and the Senate would get together and they'd try to create a compromise on the difference between the bills. Sometimes this is as simple as the first chamber passing the version that the second chamber passed. So the House could say, you know what, Senate, $800,000 is enough. Okay, let's do it. But let's imagine that they don't. The conference committee meets. They bargain out a $900,000 increase. They split the difference. And then that bill goes back to the House and Senate and has to be re-voted again. It can't be amended at this point. If both chambers then pass it, then the bill goes to the president. And I see that on my TV here, it's cutting off some of the first letters of every line. And I apologize for that. I hope you guys can kind of noodle out what those letters are. Once the president has the bill, he can sign it, and it becomes law. So that's it. Or, of course, he can veto it. He can also, under certain circumstances, issue what's called a pocket veto, which is similar to a veto, but pocket vetoes can't be overridden, but they can only happen when Congress adjourns immediately after passing the bill. So usually if Congress is kind of waiting to deal with a particularly sticky piece of legislation, they pass it, they send it to the president, and they adjourn for their recess immediately afterwards. In that circumstance, then the president can pocket veto it, basically meaning he does nothing, but because Congress isn't in session, the bill doesn't become law. And you might remember that from when we read the Constitution. That's a provision that's actually in the Constitution. If the president vetoes the bill, not all is lost. Congress can actually overturn the president's veto with a 2/3 vote of both chambers. But you can imagine that that's a pretty high bar to clear. And usually these things are pretty rare. You think that if the president's party supports him, then usually the president's party would control at least 1/3 of one of the chambers. And so, overrides of presidential vetoes, while not unheard of, are rare. Vetoes themselves are actually increasingly rare. Trump has vetoed only 6 bills in his slightly over 3 years in office. Obama and George W. Bush had 12 each in their 8-year terms. And this is mostly because if the president says, hey, if you pass that, I'm going to veto it, then Congress is not going to waste their time and pass the bill for the most part. They're going to just say, well, no point in doing any work on this if the president's just going to veto it. But the president wasn't, in the day before, 24-hour news, it wasn't always clear what the president was going to do. And sometimes Congress would pass a bill to make the president veto it because they think that the president didn't really like it, so he'd veto it, but the president might look bad vetoing it. Harry Truman vetoed over 250 bills in his just over 7 years in office. Veto overrides are extremely rare, and so you see that it's happened 8 times in the last 30 years. And then just to kind of give you an idea of how many bills actually make it to become laws, in 2019, 8,820 bills were introduced. Only 109 laws and public acts were passed. All right, that is it for today. Like I said, we're going to pick up with legislators and modern lawmaking on Monday, but that is it for this week. Thank you for a great first week in online government, and I look forward to your responses and your quiz answers, and you folks have a great weekend. Take care.